So a quick show of hands. Who in the audience is English speaking and qui parmi-vous parle français? Okay. Yes, sorry. English first. Anglais first. Sorry. Okay. Super. Et les francophones? Très peu. Ok. J'ai prévu de faire en fait le séance pour bien démarrer dans les deux langues, but I think I'll do it in English. Is that all right with you? I think we'll do that. So if anyone needs translation services, that's okay. So we'll do it in English, Alistair. All right, so this antenna is a magic antenna, all right? And if you think of the right problem in society that you have and need to solve, this magic wand is going to allow you to make that happen instantly. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, and I'll give you a quick example myself, is what's a societal problem? Well, today, lack of economic activity, a lack of economic return and exchange between citizens across the continent. So people are not earning enough money, okay, themselves. So that's a problem. And the solution, all right, and this is my vision, is I see the creation of hundreds of millions of small businesses that are part of delivering service to future African smart cities, smart villages, and connected communities. So I'd like to hand this out, and if you could just briefly introduce yourself, where you're from, your name, and to tell us your problem, and tell us your solution that this magic wand allows you to get instantly. Can we start with you?
Greg Morris from South Africa, RLB Systems. I think a major challenge in Africa is poor service delivery by governments due to lack of revenue collection. So improved revenue collection ultimately would give governments the wherewithal to provide service levels, create an upward spiral in community development.
Didn't work.
Maybe pass over. We just reached.
So you just reached.
Yes.
You just arrived.
We need to understand the context.
Okay, so we'll get back to you at the end.
Yes. Hello, good morning everyone, or good afternoon everyone. My name is Suhail Zakaria. I'm the regional director for an American company called ESRI. It's a GIS company. We have a GIS platform called the ArcGIS platform. And we believe that, this smart Africa and sustainable development is a key goal for everyone. Not only in Africa, but elsewhere. And we're here, and I'm not sure if you had a chance to visit our booth, but we're launching a brand new platform, free of charge for the entire continent, where we're making like massive content for Africa. And when I mean massive content, I mean like satellite imagery, I mean base maps, administrative boundaries, all kind of content that the African continent or any companies or any even startup or students who are working on any kind of projects that is related to smart countries, smart nations, smart continent would need in order to be able to provide maybe location-based services, location-aware solutions. So we're making this massive investment available for everyone. And not only that, we're even welcoming any entity that has any kind of content and data that is willing to contribute this data to be part of this portal. We're welcoming them as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Jean-Pierre Gatera. I'm managing director of S3 Rwanda. So we are coming from the same company, and it's the same product and solutions that we are proposing to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Roman Meyer. I work with German Development Corporation. Don't have any products to sell here. If there's something I can change with my magic wand, it would be bureaucracy. I would make rid of it, and probably the solution I see is to get the young generation into these positions and have a change of mindset and really not train the new generation to use the same old forms and stamps and signatures that we've been using all those years, but just get away with all of that and come up with new solutions and get faster and easier and simpler services for everyone.
My name's Wilson Kagabo. I work with Ngari Holdings. Ngari Holdings is an investment company, a Rwandan company in different areas. The problem I would want to see solved on the African continent is basically interconnectivity between infrastructures, mainly road infrastructure and any other logistics and transportation infrastructure. If that is solved, I think there's a lot of economic potential you would be able to unlock.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Caitlin. I'm an in-house legal counsel at Inmarsat. I won't talk about PPPs because there's going to be a lot of my team talking about that today. I think the one thing that I would like to fix with my magic wand is, as I look around at the conference, there's some women but not a lot of women, and it'd be great to see more representation of women in in the technology sector. And I think one way we can improve that is by increasing access to digital services for everyone, not making it something just accessible by the few. So that's me.
Good afternoon. My name is Martin Het Hart. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm a missionary worker here in Rwanda, in Kigali. I see a very big opportunity and potential, that is the youth. And the big challenge is to have a good education on competence-based training, including IT. So I have no solution, but I'm looking for solutions.
Good afternoon. I'm Mashami Giselle. I'm from Rwanda. I work for RISA. Well, what I would like to see here in Africa, I would like to see that the whole community accessing IT services.
My name is Donna Bethay Murphy, and I was here with the Broadband Commission. And the Broadband Commission is looking at connecting the unconnected. And one of the projects we're especially looking at now is digital literacy and the ability to educate both children to learn how to access the internet and what it can do for them, and put in safety mechanisms to protect them, but also how to retrain a workforce that is built for example, mechanics fixing a car, but now that cars have lots of coding in it, how to teach those same people how to code, and doing that through a digital transformation so that they're not out of a job.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles. I come from China, and I'm here dealing with electronics products and like Huawei and DJI and other products. But here I have an idea to share with our people, because here this is the second time I participate this TAS meeting, and last year we are here the same meeting, and I want to share one idea about, because here, the whole meeting we are talking high technology. We're talking blockchain, we're talking cashless, we're talking all these things. But I want to say, we need to think all this technology, we put more on the agriculture part. Because you can see, the whole Africa, the agriculture is totally undeveloped. And if we're talking more industry, but for this continent, it's not really to be the number one priority. So because the agriculture should be the one to booming. Because you see, we are talking cashless, we are talking blockchain, but before that, we don't have too much cash. So why are you talking cashless? If we are a billionaire, we cannot carry the cash. We're talking cashless. So that's why I want to share, we need to focus more on the agriculture to make the whole Africa continent to be the culture number one powerful, and then talking the industry. For example, China. You see China, every day we can say, we can see everything made in China, but this is a very big system to be partner each other. If here you want to make a factory, every small component, you need another factory to help you. But where it is, maybe it's in China or in another continent. So that is what I want to share. Thank you.
Got one of these in my golf. I'm Kendall James. I'm from Hexagon Geospatial. And for me, one of the critical things as a geographer is, and we look at smart cities as one of the concepts that need to be solved, is safe cities. And we can have all the digital technology and everything in the world, but how do we make our citizens safe? So, through the, and by using those kind of technologies, one of the things I've noticed, particularly in South Africa, is the overdevelopment of space. We have very little public open space that people feel safe to go to. So the whole notion of public lighting and things like that doesn't necessarily make it safer. We need to create these areas where people will interact, because I'm a firm believer where people congregate and where it's well lit and it's open, safety comes there, because we generally will look after each other. So that's that kind of my sort of silver bullet.
My name is Muto. I'm coming from Japan. I'm a partner at Gahigiro Capital. It's a private equity venture capital investment firm. The things I want to see, or I want to contribute, or I want to participate here in Africa is that providing risk capital. Obviously, there are high growth in Africa. There are so many opportunities, but who's going to take the risk? I want to, we are the firm who wants to seek for opportunity and also minimize the risk, how we can participate in the risk capital providation process in this growth, and also part of the Transform Africa or Rwanda's smart city ideas. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Gordon McMillan. I'm part of the Inmarsat team talking to you this afternoon. I think the thing for me, if I could wave my magic wand and change it, would be education. Better use of technology to improve education. I'm based in South Africa, and there's a real problem in South Africa with education for government schools, and I'm involved in it in a slightly oblique way. So I'm very aware of the problem, and I think we can really make better use of technology to improve education, which will have a longer and lasting term effect. So that's my area for improvement. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Innocent Wimana. I'm here as a chairperson of the Rwanda Association for Local Government Authority. I would like to participate in this session to see how the PPP can improve to leverage our finance in our cities, in our secondary cities especially, how we can leverage our finance through PPP. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very, very much indeed for your fantastic contributions. It is really a good exercise, and hold on to that particular problem solution idea that is in your mind. And what we would like to do is to take this magic wand and turn that into something that is actionable and real for the real world. For those of you who joined a little bit late, we've just run through an icebreaker session where we were warming up to introduce ourselves, and I'll just give a little recap for those of you who joined late. This antenna is a magic antenna. It allows you to instantly create a solution, but it'll only work if you have a clear and compelling and interesting societal problem that needs a solution. So I think for time, we're going to hand it over to Brandon, who's going to talk about public-private partnerships. And I'd like to thank you very, very much for your time.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure when you read on the schedule that this was a panel discussion, you didn't realize that you were going to be the panel this afternoon. So we thank you all for your thoughts and participation. What we'd like to talk to you about today, if we can get the slides going on the screen, is a different take on the traditional investment model of public-private partnerships. As some members of the audience here alluded to today, public-private partnerships have been around for a long time. And they have a well-understood risk and return profile, generally speaking, when it comes to infrastructure. But one of the key things that hasn't been looked after in traditional public-private partnership or PPP models is this idea of sustainability. Oftentimes, when you look at traditional infrastructure, public-private partnerships, the return model is based on external returns. So there will be an investment made in some infrastructure, and that investment will be recouped through other avenues outside of the project. And what we really want to focus on today is a different take on P3s, which is this idea of a sustainable P3, or projects that are structured holistically in nature, where they actually are increasing the capacity and generating new returns, new cost savings, and new revenues to in fact pay back the initial investment, and in doing so sustain themselves. So the idea behind sustainable P3s is that they are investment neutral initiatives where there's at the end of the program there is $0 that has effectively been invested by the government or by other parties. Oh, thank you, appreciate it. So let's try to jump into this here. There we go. So this is the framework that I'd like to share with you of how to structure a sustainable public-private partnership. If you look at the bottom, you'll see a vision and policy. Next phase being intelligent infrastructure, followed by intelligent integration, and finally building connected communities. And when you build a program around all four of these entities, it ends up creating a sustainable loop that provides a different risk-return profile than your more traditional P3 investments. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of these and then go through a few examples. Also, I'd like to point out that I only have a few slides here, and we would like to make this more of an interactive discussion. So think about, as we're going through this, the ideas that you shared at the beginning of the session today, and if you'd like, we can talk through a few of these cases that you brought up as examples of way that you can go back and potentially apply this model to solve some of those challenges that we mentioned earlier. So if you look at the bottom, as we mentioned, the first step in creating a sustainable PPP program is starting with people. A lot of times you'll think, oh, in an infrastructure project, it's the infrastructure that comes first, it's the technology that comes first, the ICT that comes first. But in fact, if you don't start with the people and with the vision and the policy, oftentimes you'll miss one of these key elements along the road. And so whenever we start one of these programs, we sit down and figure out who are the stakeholders for any particular outcome, who are the actual communities that you want to impact first, and how do you want to expand that impact of those outcomes to a broader set of stakeholders. And we'll talk about a little bit how that goes, but once you understand who you're trying to impact with a particular outcome, that then gives you the strategy to build an infrastructure and a technology framework around. So the next step, once you understand what the vision is, what policies you're going to implement to achieve that vision, infrastructure is obviously another big component of this. Now, here at Transform Africa, we're all about intelligent infrastructure and how ICT can be overlaid on top of things like water, energy, communications, and security, transportation. Those traditional infrastructure models, how do you make them smart? And in doing so, create this intelligent infrastructure. Now, a key part about intelligent infrastructure versus traditional infrastructure is that they generate data. And this data is critical in future phases of a sustainable PPP because it's that data that often creates the new capacity, the new cost savings, the new revenue streams that can support the overall program. We'll talk about that shortly. A next big step, which is often overlooked, is this idea of integration. So how do I take all this disparate infrastructure and the data that the infrastructure is generating, and bring that together in a place where it can be accessed by all the different members of the community. So as an example, if I am a member of the public versus a professor at a university versus a employee for the government, I'm going to have different needs and different means under which I need to access that infrastructure and the data that it's generating. And finally, once you're able to install intelligent infrastructure based on a vision, and you're able to bring that data together, you're able to finally achieve those outcomes that you originally had planned. And that's where the connected community and really the outcomes that drive a sustainable framework come into place. So let's talk about a couple of examples here just to give some clarity into this framework. So this is from a perspective of a citizen, and this is something we're doing. I'm from the US, so this is something that we're doing in the States. It can be as simple as taking the bus to where you need to go every day. Now, this is a simple bus stop in, I believe this is Washington, D.C. actually, where it tells you the buses that come and tells you where to wait for the bus. And traditional infrastructure, that's what it does. Now, if you can imagine, this is physical infrastructure, but if you can imagine the data that's being generated by all the buses and the rest of the transportation system, how could that data be brought into a simple example of how do I take the bus to where I need to go to improve the infrastructure and to improve the outcome and the lives of a day-to-day citizen? So here we use kind of the nexus between the physical world and the digital world, your mobile device. And this particular mobile device uses augmented reality. So when you use your smart transportation app, in this case, it opens up the camera on the phone, and if you hold it up to the plain old traditional bus stop sign, it overlays all of that data then that is coming from other areas of the transportation system. So it'll tell you a real-time timetable of when the bus is supposed to arrive. It'll give you the location of the bus and tell you the bus is going to be here 5 minutes later than expected. If you speak different languages, as is the case in DC, you can switch and get all this information in your language of choice. And if the bus is going to be late and you want, the bus is 15 minutes late and you'd like to grab a cup of coffee, it'll actually tell you where the nearest coffee shop is. And in doing so, generate some revenue to offset the application and the infrastructure itself. Another example is in the life of a tourist. So one of the great things that a smart city and this intelligent infrastructure can provide is economic development opportunities and ways to engage and delight visitors to your city. So this is actually, I think this is in DC too. Okay, it's very good. So this is in Washington, DC. This is another bus stop. And traditionally, in the US bus stops, you'll see advertisements. So this will just be a poster essentially telling you to go to the library that's across the street. Now this is great, but this is not really a way to engage a tourist who may be on their way to another destination or who may have questions about, what's going on in the library, what's inside, and why should I go there. Again, using this same app, you can create new forms of engagement with tourists based on things you're trying to drive. So as they hold up their Smart City app to the poster, all kinds of information, again, can be overlaid upon that screen. And so they can find out facts about what's going on in the library, different events going on, and the best way to get there. Which bus will get me there the most efficiently, or which form of transportation will get me there. And finally, from a last perspective, of course, is a day in the life of a smart government employee or a smart government official. How can these types of solutions make government more efficient and help them in the jobs that they do on an everyday basis? And so here we take an example of something as simple as a fire hydrant. So fire hydrants, as you can tell, have a pretty long lifespan. They're out there for 40, 60 years sometimes. And when they were originally deployed, it looked like that with a little less rust, right? But there's no information about the condition of this fire hydrant other than how it looks, how it's integrated into the rest of the system, until you, again, can use a Smart City application to overlay that data. And so this gives you a history of how often it's been tested, the condition, the pressure, and other types of things like this, so that if a first responder or an emergency personnel have to use this device, they can quickly assess the condition of it prior to utilization. And so these are a few examples of how you can take that paradigm of starting with the vision and then overlaying the infrastructure and the data and creating outcomes with your investment to drive sustainability. When we talk about intelligent infrastructure and smart cities, again, these are just some of the areas where these sustainable public-private partnerships can come into play. And often when we talk about risk profiles, one of the things that's really important is to get some diversity across these applications. One of the most powerful things about a smart city from an investment standpoint is the fact that there is some diversity across all these different areas, which gives you some risk management, but also gives you some synergies in terms of being able to leverage infrastructure investments across many different areas that can potentially drive a return. Other reason why I have this up here, these are just some ideas for you to think about. So as we get into a discussion, be happy to talk about any of these specifically if you have any questions of things going on globally in these areas. Now, I want to talk a little bit now specifically about the sustainability portion of the public-private partnership investment. What we've talked about here are some ideas of solutions and outcomes that can be invested in, but I want to spend some time talking about how a sustainable PPP is a means for the governments in concert with commercial partners to do so in a way that is a neutral investment vehicle. So the first thing we do is, as we mentioned, we invest in the infrastructure. And when we invest in the infrastructure, we divide it into two categories. So there are some infrastructure investments that serve purely a public good. Some things in terms of generating outcomes, some things you do purely to build capacity or to better the lives of the population. Other infrastructure investments have a clear ROI, meaning that when you do things like you install a small cell, as an example, on the commercial side, that has a return on your investment through the revenues that you can generate from that small cell. Similarly, if you deploy new energy generation through solar, these things are very well understood and have a positive ROI. And the key to sustainability, going back to the idea of deploying multiple programs simultaneously, is if you can pair infrastructure investments that are for the public good with infrastructure investments that have a well-understood return on that investment, well-understood ROI, when you bring those together, they can in fact offset. So as an example, here in Kigali, there's a great master plan for building a smart city. It's a key initiative, as we've talked about today. If that entire smart city plan is going to cost, say, $100 million, what we can do is we look for $100 million in offsetting programs in telecommunications and energy and water and all these different areas. And when you combine those together, the programs then become sustainable, where you can invest in them. And the program itself over 30 years has a self-sustaining payback model. And here's what you see there, where once the infrastructure is in the ground, we can then generate these projects over a longer period of time to achieve those outcomes that we're looking to achieve. There's a four-step process that we usually apply for these sustainability models, and we'll talk about these one at a time here. The first step is going back to the vision and policy, is where we sit down with governments and we help them understand what are not the technology again that we look to deploy, but what are the outcomes we're looking to achieve. What's top of mind for the public? What's top of mind for different institutions within the government in terms of modernizing infrastructure and the outcomes you're looking to achieve? So we want to help people get around more efficiently with new forms of transportation. We want to provide greater safety to the public through lighting and through different public safety initiatives. These types of outcome-based approaches are critical, because once we understand the outcomes that you're looking to achieve, we can then figure out what infrastructure and what technology will get you there. And typically in this phase, again, and this is similarly what's already been done here for the Rwanda Master Plan, is this gives you a blueprint of what your smart city program looks like, and essentially will give you an idea of the cost of implementing this program. So the second phase is then where the sustainability model comes in, where again, if we've identified a $100 million smart city program for a city as an example, we can sit down and figure out what other partners can we bring into the program that can provide new revenues to offset this investment, or can provide new ways to save costs to offset this investment. And this is where it's critical to engage commercial parties such as your telecommunications providers, your energy providers, different partners, different manufacturing partners that may be locally located. When you engage all of these individual partners, you can have a similar exercise and understand what are their goals, what are their investments looking like, and where are they going to be, and find synergies where these investments can overlap. A common example of this is your street light, where the streetlight is becoming one of the critical assets for smart cities investments, not only for the city itself, but for many commercial partners that operate in the area. So just as a streetlight can provide safety through lighting to the public, it also serves as an ideal site for access points for mobile operators, access points for Wi-Fi. It can serve as an energy store for electric utilities. So by looking at what a city is trying to do with their plan and how it can be married with commercial partners, you're able to build a self-funding model where your initial investment can be paid back internally through making new markets in the commercial space. And finally, modernizing the city and being able to implement all that. There are three key challenges when we work with the city, and we've talked to about 100 cities at this point about their smart city objectives, and three key challenges always come up. The first is funding, and it has to do with everything we're talking about in a sustainable PPP model. But the second two, which typically you don't find out until you get into an implementation, are the technical complexities and the programmatic complexities that are involved in with multiple stakeholders on the public side, on the private side, multiple types of infrastructure programs across all those areas we talked about. And so it's critical that before you set out on an implementation of a project that you've crafted, that you take all of these considerations into mind and make sure that you have some of the technical architectures and some of the programmatic architectures developed in advance. And finally, once you deliver the infrastructure, a key part is making sure, again, that infrastructure is translated into outcomes. And so one of the most important part, I think this is the most overlooked part of any smart city program, is this idea of how do I engage specific communities to make sure that they're taking advantage of the investments I've made, and so that you can truly build capacity, so that you can truly build new economic sectors. And for that, the hardest step is really identifying that's an important component of a program. From there, it's really as simple as reaching out to those communities and finding those stakeholders and creating programs, training programs, educational programs, outreach programs to make sure that those communities are engaged with the investments you've made. And when you do that, when you take these 4 steps into a plan, it gives you 2 key things. It gives you a revenue neutral sustainable public-private partnership program, so a program that with an initial investment can fund itself and pay that investment back. And it gives you a connected community, a community that's truly engaged with these investments and that is building capacity and building an economy around everything that you put together. I'll show this real quick. This is a structure of how, actually I'll go back here. This is a structure of how the sustainable public-private partnerships are often set up. Usually starts with a special purpose vehicle set up for a particular smart city or particular program. And really it starts with the government, obviously, and the government setting that vision and creating that policy that then a program can be built around. After after a program is constructed by the government, this is where the investment community can then come into play. And through blended financing models that we've been talking about, international banks, development banks, international institutions, institutional investors of other types can come together and fund through this the sustainable PPP model. This is a very attractive model from the investment community standpoint. Many institutions globally are looking for long-term, low-risk, diversified infrastructure programs. And so typically the money is available, especially when they're structured in this way. And the key part is that the investment community here is providing the financing to get your program kickstarted. The program itself is the one that's paying this initial investment back. Here we talk again about delivery and this idea of having both the ability to design and build this program, but also crucially the right mechanisms in place to operate and maintain the infrastructure, and to make sure that the public is being engaged and is utilizing it. And finally, the other key part of the private side of the public-private partnership are our commercial partners and the revenue streams and investments that they can bring in to pay back this model. So with that, I'll stop here, and we're going to go back to an interactive part of our panel discussion today with our lovely panel here. If you remember in the beginning, you had some great ideas in terms of outcomes that you'd like to generate. And if anyone has one that they'd like to share, we can collectively talk about how this model can potentially be applied to help you go back and start achieving some of these great ideas and these great outcomes you're looking for. Anybody want to go first? Thanks. So any questions in general from everyone here today about the model or otherwise? Yes, sir. We're going to get you a mic here.
I don't like
Sorry, you're
Hello,
live.
Erik here from Denmark. Sorry, I was not here from the early beginning, but I am very keen about you saying something about green bonds and green loans, if you didn't say already. And how do they come in, and when do they come in, and how much of leverage can we have also in a PPP setup for smart cities?
Green bonds and green loans and their place in a sustainable P3 model. I think the nice part about this model, and maybe I'll go back to this for an example, when you talk about blended financing, I think this opportunity, there's an opportunity for those and other investment vehicles, and I think the more diversity you can get across the type of investments you're bringing into a program of this nature, the better. Both because it provides a more attractive profile for some of the investors, but it also helps you with your with the sustainability of it as well. So was there something specific?
No,
about
it's
those?
fine. Then what I say? How much do you see a stake in the finance being the 1 or the 2 or the 3rd? I mean, what is a typical financing ratio or debt ratio or whatever in this setup? Rule of thumb, if there is anything.
The answer is there's no rule of thumb. I think it's very contingent on the project, and it's very contingent on where it's being implemented. And I think what we try to do is we try to build as much flexibility into the programs as possible. As an example, because typically these programs are structured over 30 years, a lot of times you'll have investments that actually have a smaller window than that, right? So you'll have a bond that's needs a 5-year return. You'll have an investor that has a 10-year window, and so by structuring the investment vehicle, and that's why we use an SPV, you're actually able to accommodate many different entities, many different forms of investment, including the green bonds, in a way where the overall program essentially isn't impacted by the form of the investment. It kind of goes on its own. And so that's a key part of that SPV.
I allow another one then. How do you see in the African space also pension funds coming in this blended funding? Is it there?
Yeah.
Is it happening? Yeah. Or if it's not, what's holding them back?
I think that's a great question, and I think there's a significant amount of money locked up in sovereign funds and pension funds and family offices that are looking for well understood infrastructure investment opportunities. And I think the key there is well understood, because as someone mentioned earlier, at the end of the day for these types of projects, there is a lack of long-term low risk and projects, right? And then when you're talking about institutional investors, it needs to be hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and so. Smart city programs under this model actually end up being a perfect opportunity for those institutions to invest in, because you have the size that they're looking for, you have the duration that they're looking for, and so the key is to make sure that the program is well understood enough, the business model is well understood enough, and some of the things, some of the other risk profiles are well understood enough where they're comfortable that the risk versus the return is adequate. And so one of the things that really helps with that is this idea of building sustainability through commercial revenues, as well as cost savings that a government can create for itself by having a diversity of streams to pay the investment back. That's really a key that institutional investors are looking for. If they're investing in a specific department within a government for a single project, so if it's a solar farm or if it's water infrastructure, things like that, that's a lot less attractive, right? Because you have one thing, you have one entity that's paying you back, versus if you're able to create a diversified program like this, where you have commercial parties that are participating as well as the government, and it's across multiple different projects, that creates a much more attractive risk profile in terms of lower risk, higher probability of payback that those investors really need in order to participate. And so that they're actually one of our best investors, because again, they have capital that they're looking to deploy, and this is what they're looking for. Great questions, thank you. Any questions from anyone else? Yes, sir.
Thank you. We're involved in a number of PPPs in Africa. My sort of overriding view is that the types of projects proposed generally are too complex for the real requirements on the ground. Projects that Africa needs are more basic projects, more basic PPPs, which your traditional investors would view as high risk. And they certainly don't lend themselves to 30-year projects. Certainly if there's technology involved, the evolution of technology is too fast. There needs to be a replacement cycle built in much shorter time frames. So ours are typically 10-year projects, focused on both revenue enhancement for governments with a view to ultimately improving service delivery and building local capacity. But there are more micro campaigns. Your typical investment is the $3 to $5 million investments, which is less attractive to these large funds that want to deploy large capital. But those large capital projects, maybe in road infrastructure or utility infrastructure, exist, but the more basic requirements, which is really what Africa needs, are typically unfunded.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I always I know when there's someone who's been on the ground doing things, because those are the exact questions that always emerge, right? And I think, again, this goes back to this challenge of programmatic complexity and technical complexity, right? Because to your point, some of the most impactful things are simple, don't necessarily have a return at all if they have one. Yeah. So some certainly do, right? But those are typically the things that provide the most public value, and at the same time are the hardest to invest in. And so there's really two things, and I didn't bring this slide here with me today, but I'll talk a little bit about it. Is the way we're able to get around that is to present a vision of here's what a 30-year very complex program looks like. But then you divide that up into much smaller portions. And so the way we structure these programs is we have a 30-year master plan, if you will, right? Of here are all the different outcomes, some large, some small, some that will take 15 years to achieve, some that can be achieved in 3 years. And we put those all together, and we put a business model around the entirety of that program. But then the key is that there's flexibility built into it. So there's actually 5 to 10 year infrastructure replacement cycles, right? Technology refreshes that you have to build in. And what we actually do is we have 18-month implementation cycles. And so if for a smart city program, I forget what the number is here for Rwanda, but so let's say there's 15 priorities, right, that you'd like to achieve over a 30-year period. Certainly doable over 30 years, but let's start with the top 3 first. So for this 18-month cycle, we're going to focus on 3 programs, and one may be a large energy project, and 2 may be smaller programs that are going to be very impactful. We talk about quick wins being very important, where you have to have some things that the average citizen can benefit from and can really understand. And so what we do is we structure the program accordingly so that you have a mix of those, and every 18 months you're constantly reevaluating to see what's top of mind now for both the public, the government, and commercial partners. And in doing that, it helps you bridge that gap that investors are looking for, because now they have an understanding. The investors care about their return, right, which ultimately is how much money I'm going to make and what's the risk of me achieving that. And so if you're able to present this longer term vision as we are through a program like this, and then you're able to show them how that program is flexible enough to be successful, and how you're managing the risk through some of these things like diversification and through these cycles, then you're able to face that challenge, because that's 100%, I think, the biggest challenge that a lot of cities and a lot of different institutions face when they do these programs. Was there another question? Oh, maybe this gentleman right here.
All right, I'm Desiree from Telecom. Just wanted to ask a question related to what was actually highlighted in the plenary session. You've got pieces put together at a different stage and different stakeholders. And when I look at your model, you're proposing, it's like you're starting from ground, you build it up, an idea, you fund it, you run it, and you sort of commercialize it and then you generate return to the investors. But I'm looking at typical, maybe Rwanda or African reality. You have someone invested here, another one here, another one here. How do you come in to make it sustainable? Thank you.
Yeah, because it's a nice philosophical approach, right? But the reality is that's never how it is. Even and this is that's true globally, right? Anywhere you go, some places you're very lucky where it's a true greenfield project. Where as an example, there are several places here that are building innovation cities from scratch. That's a wonderful opportunity where a model like this makes sense on its face. The reality is when you're implementing one of these programs, though, almost anywhere you go, to your point, there are many different stakeholders, typically who haven't worked together. And there are many different investments that are already have already been made and are already in play and already need returns. And so in this first phase, jump back here a few slides. In this first phase, where we talk about the government defining what a smart city program is for them, it's a lot more complex than that, obviously. And so one of the key things in this phase is not only are you defining what a smart city program is to your city or to the government, but you're figuring out how do I slowly bring in other stakeholders and include their priorities and their strategy into this vision. And so as an example, when we do this with cities, what we'll often do is we'll have the city go through this exercise first, where they'll have a leadership team, and then they'll gradually bring in other members of the community, other members across the city to build out their smart city vision. But then the next step is to engage all the other stakeholders. So engage your telecommunications company, engage some of the large commercial entities that are local, and we do similar exercises with them where we understand where are you making investments, how are you looking to accelerate your growth, and how can we bring your plan into this one. And so by doing that, and it is a complicated process, and it's kind of funny, the further along you go, the easier it gets. I think the biggest challenge is this first one is and it's almost an art a lot of times, is how do I engage this broader group of stakeholders and make sure that all of our goals are aligned. But it is something that's achievable, and I think that's the really nice part about smart cities is when you have these conversations, it turns out that most of the time everyone's goals are often aligned in terms of what they're trying to modernize, in terms of who they're trying to reach out to, and in terms of some of the outcomes they're looking for. But that's I think the answer is it's a progressive cycle of engaging a broader and broader set of stakeholders until you have everyone you need at the table. And then it's an ongoing process. We mentioned it's a 30-year process. So there is this idea of you're always reaching out, you're always engaging. And as other stakeholders, as commercial stakeholders, priorities change, those can kind of be reevaluated and the program can change accordingly. But I think that's one of the threads that's ongoing in order for a program like this to be successful, is constantly reaching out and having that feedback incorporated into the program. And again, that's why we have those 18-month cycles as an example, is so that that's possible. But that was a great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I have two quick questions.
Yes.
One is that I have experience with engaged with issuing green bonds or social responsibility securities. In this context, there are some investors, asset management companies, or some of the investment companies. They really care about what kind of impact they actually can bring about. For instance, Sustainalytics or some of the performance-based analytical companies. They really care about if they hire those companies, and then they can track those impacts and the results. In the PPP field, from practitioners' viewpoints, do you feel this is a necessary process, or hiring those analytical companies through that process? And the second question is that securitization of some of the assets of the PPPs. Do you see any views or any trends in African PPP field?
So those are two great questions. I'll start with the first one, and this goes back to the question earlier about sustainability bonds and green bonds, and the different types of returns that those are looking for in addition to potentially a financial one. One of the interesting things about that, which is why those bonds are great for smart city programs or for a lot of the capacity building programs we're talking about, is those types of non-monetary payback that they're looking for are the exact same thing that members of the public are looking for. And so when we talk about how to make infrastructure investments successful, how to truly make sure that when you invest in infrastructure, it's truly building capacity, it's helping people learn, it's helping businesses get started, economies grow. You can easily branch that out to it's helping with sustainability in terms of energy efficiency, if that's an example for a green bond. But one of the key parts, going back to engagement, is whenever you make an investment, you always want to track those metrics, because ultimately those are what the public care about. The public doesn't necessarily care that your infrastructure investment had a positive return. What they care about is that it's meaningful for them. For many people, they care that it's meaningful for the environment. And so what we always encourage is, at the beginning, when you're selecting the outcomes that you want to achieve, you do two things, right? One is you may have a high-level outcome, like we want to increase transportation efficiency, but you have to do a few things there. You have to talk about what specifically I'm going to do to make that happen, what communities I'm going to target to do that with, and what are the outcomes that I'm going to measure success by. And when you're able to do that, it helps, because then when you go back and someone from the public's saying, what have you done for me lately? You can say, well, I made this investment in the transportation infrastructure. It's decreased congestion by this much. It's decreased greenhouse gas emission by this much. And that's something really meaningful that you can then, publicize, both to the citizens and to the world more broadly. And that is exactly what those investors are looking for as well. So there's definitely alignment there, absolutely. And your second question was about the securitization. Securitization is something that we talk about a lot of times. It's especially for smart cities investments. It's an early market for the securitization of a package like we typically put together, but there are definitely opportunities for that, we think. And the key part is you need to, again, when you're defining the vision in the beginning, set some policies and some parameters around this. So as an example, what we always recommend is that the government maintain ownership or think about certainly maintaining ownership of the assets themselves versus selling the assets to another party or securitizing those assets. Same thing with the data, maintaining ownership of your data. This is a big one where a lot of cities we work with sold off their data because they didn't really see a lot of value in it. And that creates challenges both from, in the future when you find out, hey, there actually is a lot of value to this data, but also for things like privacy when you realize some of the ways that the people you sold the data to are monetizing that. You want to make sure that, as a city, as a government, that you're really controlling those two things because your assets and your data are really the key value drivers for the next, certainly 30, 50 years, right? So we always say when you're thinking about securitization, think about maintaining control of those assets and securitizing other parts of the program itself. But I think, specifically, I think that's really an early market, and so a lot of it's private placement right now. As smart cities grow, certainly here in Africa, I think there's certainly an opportunity to bring it to broader markets. Thanks. Any other questions? Yes, sir, in the back. Bring a mic your way.
Thank you. My question is about the inclusiveness of the smart cities, because we're going to a smart city, but what about the most underprivileged people in the city? So I would want you to talk a little bit about the inclusiveness of the smart city model. Thank you.
Thank you. And so the question about inclusiveness is a critical one, and so two things to maybe consider. So first of all, we always talk about smart cities because that's the the marketing phrase or the phrase we all use, but it really is smart society, smart communities. So it could just as easily be a smart village. It could be a smart country, smart continent, and so. The same principles and the same approach applies to any scale. And so part of inclusiveness is not just thinking about what you can do in your biggest cities, but really where the opportunity and where the need lies. And it may very well be other areas that can benefit the most, can actually implement programs like this the quickest, because of that great need. So that's one thing to consider, is it doesn't always have to be the biggest city in a country that you look to implement that. Certainly there's benefits for that. The second part to consider is when we talk about which communities you're going to target with any specific program. So if an example, connectivity, right? We talked about this earlier today. If you're looking to expand connectivity, the key thing to think about is, so that's the outcome you're looking for, but what communities am I going to target specifically for that? And what we typically always recommend is do the hardest one first, because if you can prove something works with the most underserved community, it's then much easier. Well, it does two things, right? First of all, it serves the greatest need. And it shows that really, if you can do it with the most underserved community and the community that may be the hardest to achieve it with, that you can do it anywhere. And so I think that's a key part in the beginning when you're planning your strategy, is to make sure that you're not just doing it in the easy places that are the most visible, but you're doing it in the places, you make sure you identify the communities that have the greatest need, that are the most underserved, and that you start there, because that's where your greatest quick wins come from in the beginning, is if you can point to communities that have the greatest need and address that need. Oftentimes it's a lot more impactful with the public than if you do something easy that may not serve as much good. Does that answer your question? Did you have another part about that? That's good. Okay. Good.
Thank you. With all these innovative ways of making smart cities and etc., there is a lot of data that's going to be collected. So how do you look at data analysis side of the things, data visualization, and at the same time securing the data, and where is that data?
Yeah, data. Data is a very interesting topic because really in a lot of ways, especially when you talk about sustainability of PPPs, it's really nascent. There's not a lot of great ways that you can monetize data today, but guaranteed it's coming. We're working with entities that are setting up, essentially data stock markets, data exchanges, coming up with ways to grade the quality of data so that it can be understood and invested in. So this is coming, and so the time is now to think about how you're addressing a lot of those things like security and so forth. And so, a couple of maybe points that we consider. The first is to have a very strong policy about data utilization and data and privacy. And really understanding, again, this is why it goes back to making sure that you ultimately own the data, even though you may grant access to others. But making sure that when you're defining this vision in the beginning, part of that vision, or part of that definition needs to be reaching out to different members of different stakeholders and understanding, the trade-off between how much do we want to monetize data and make data available versus, what are the rights of citizens and the privacy implications of doing so. And when you address that in the beginning and keep a transparent process in place, that really makes sure that you're providing the greatest benefit to the public, both in terms of assuring their privacy, but also making enough data possible in enough different ways to do some of these great things with AI and big data and things like that we discuss. So typically what we do is and this is where technology comes into play, so you can do things like blockchain and so forth, where a lot of the data, interestingly enough, especially when it revolves personally identifiable information, can be anonymized and provide most of the value. Typically, you don't need to know who it is that's doing something, you just need to know what they're doing. And so by using technology to make sure that that data truly is anonymized, that allows you to make that data available, but still, maintain, the right mix of privacy. And so a lot of it has to do with anonymizing data. Another critical thing is we call it kind of the grades of data, right? So it ends up, for any of you that have implemented IoT projects or smart city projects, one of the first things you'll realize is that the data is not very useful as is, right? You'll get a lot of different data from a lot of different sensors and a lot of different inputs, and none of it matches. It's all from different products, and it's different protocols, and so a lot of one of the biggest challenges with data is how do I add value on top of this raw data that I have? And so there's really an opportunity here. And so usually what we'll do is, as an example, we'll have all of the raw data, and we'll comb through that and figure out, okay, what should be made publicly available, what should be anonymized, and what should be held back for government use or what have you, right? What's that right mix? That data we then make available through an open data platform where anybody can come access that data, and importantly, anybody can add value on top of that data, because that's one of the critical ways to make sure an open data initiative succeeds, is to make sure that it's accessible and that people can go and add their own value on top of it that folks can then utilize. So as an example, you may have kind of the first step is you have that raw, dirty data that may be coming from a bunch of different sources and it doesn't line up. Someone can go in, a member of the public, a university, a member of the government can go in and clean that data so that all that data now is aligned, it's using similar metrics of measurement, and that data now has new value that it didn't have before. And oftentimes that value that's been added can be monetized because, again, you've done the work to create a value that now many more people can utilize, right? So whereas that dirty data, that raw data, may not necessarily be useful, once it's cleaned up and curated, there's all kinds of different things that can typically be done. And so you can kind of apply that up to higher levels of analytics, right? So if you have curated data, that's one thing. If you have analyses based on that data, if you've trained AI machines to off of that data, there's all kinds of higher levels of value that can be created, and ways that those higher levels can then be monetized or accessed by different parties. So that's something, that kind of layered approach to data is something to consider, which is, what do I want to make available? How do I want to make it available? And how do I want that to be monetized? But again, one of the key parts is make sure that you maintain ownership of the original stuff, because ultimately that's the underpinning of all the value that can be added on top of it. Thanks. Yes, sir, in the front, because I know you've been waiting.
Thank you. You pretty much answered some of the questions I had already now, but talking trend and what's going on going forward. I'm thinking, like you mentioned, blockchain. I don't know if you can add a little bit more, it would be nice. But on top of it, how about the C40? This constitution of the bigger cities and so on. Do they come with something now leading the development within smarter cities? So where's the standards being set for smart cities or future cities?
Yeah, no,
it can be fluffy around SDGs and so on, I guess, but there must be something across the continent coming along, or what?
I think that's going to be one of the greatest near-term challenges for smart cities, is this idea of standardization. And I think if you look at what's gone on in other industries, you look at telecommunications, for this group is another example of every time there's a new standard that comes out, kind of the wars that go on in terms of standardization. Well, I don't think there's going to be any smart city standards wars. It is a challenge where the standardization is very fragmented. And it's just one of those things that I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge that just needs to be accounted for. I think it's fair to say that certainly I don't think anyone here. I know a lot of people that are here because you're looking to do something, to do some real things. Those real things and those projects, you can't wait for standards to emerge. And so I think it's just going to be one of those things where the standards are going to go on in parallel. And you need to build enough flexibility into your programs and into your infrastructure investments that as those standards coalesce, you're able to meet up with them. And that's a challenge, right? That's certainly easy to say and very hard to do. But that's the reality of where the space is there are no standards, certainly globally, but even continentally. I think this institution here and all of us coming together, I think, is going to provide Africa with actually a much more efficient and I think, frankly, here I think those standards are going to emerge much more quickly than elsewhere because there is this body set up. But again, I think the answer probably has to be that it needs to come down to flexibility in how you structure your programs, because we all want to do things today, and the standards aren't going to be here quite yet.
My question is on the risks. What are the major risks are you talking about in this kind of partnership, from the government point of view, but also from an investor's point of view? And how can you ensure those risks, basically to make it more financially feasible as a project? That's one. The second one is about the length of the partnership. You're looking on the concession agreements. How many years are we talking about here?
That's a great question, and so I'll answer your second question first. So our default for smart city programs is 30 years, and it's really it's a long time, and it's really for two reasons. The first reason is because for a lot of these harder outcomes that we're really looking to achieve in terms of capacity building and broad infrastructure implementation, they take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years to truly impact all of the public, all of the population. The second reason is because when you have that long of a payback period, it does two things. First of all, it reduces the amount of payback year over year that's required, right? So if you pay back over a 30-year period versus a 3-year period, obviously it's much less payback year over year. The other thing that it does, though, when it comes to risk, is it actually, because we've structured this program in an agile fashion, where every 18 months we're recalibrating the program, the longer duration, and it's kind of counterintuitive, so actually the longer duration, the less risky it is, because what happens is after the first 18 months, not only do the priorities get reevaluated, but the business model gets reevaluated as well. And so if the returns, right, if your energy savings, if your commercial revenues are overperforming or underperforming, you can recalibrate the remainder of the 30-year program to offset that performance. And so what it does is it gives you a lot more flexibility if you operate in kind of this agile framework, to be able to reduce a lot of the risk that's based on performance or based on all of these different parties participating. I'm sorry, what was your first question? Oh,
was about risk.
Okay,
What are
about
the
risk.
major risks from the government side, from the investment side, and how do you ensure those risks?
So yeah, so that was the other great question. So just as I said, the longer it is programmatically, you know, it actually reduces risk. It also introduces some other challenges when you talk about that length, because just as we mentioned, priorities change. The length of programs, you know, obviously traditionally introduced some risk, right? Because over 30 years, a lot of things could happen, and that's one of the things that a lot of institutional investors look at, is how can I offset some of those external risks to programs, and the answer we have for that is this. I'll go back to this model for a moment. When you have this public-private partnership structure where you have investor communities making investments, government making investment, and commercial partners making investment, that helps solve a lot of that challenge of kind of external parameters impacting programs, because it does two things. First of all, when everyone has a combined vision, when everyone has skin in the game, so you know, your governments, your investor communities, your commercial communities, when you have multiple parties, that again is a way to diversify and offset some of that risk, right? Because if a government, as an example, is seeing returns in terms of the public good, if everyone really likes the Smart City program, they're not going to do a lot to change that, you know, that program, because it's a good thing for everyone. Similarly, on the commercial side, if commercial partners are seeing growth and are seeing savings in their traditional investments, they're not going to want to change or exit the program either. So part of it is by creating the public-private partnerships and bringing in multiple types of stakeholders and investors is a key way that the institutional investment community sees as offsetting some of these traditional external risks. The other thing is the SPV itself creates some flexibility, because we talked about this at the very beginning. Some investors are looking for a shorter window, right? Some institutional folks want a 10-year window versus a 30-year window. By having a entity that has all of the different investors, participating in it, investors can come and go as they please, right? So if a government, if a commercial institution, or even if an investor, would like to get out of the program, there's a mechanism built in for them to do so. And so by creating, again, the theme of this is kind of flexibility, right? By creating a financial vehicle that multiple different types of parties can invest in, but still have the flexibility to come and leave as they need, that's something that the institutional community is really looking for, right? Because I think, that's the number one thing, is when I have a long-term investment program, how do I make sure that, A, the program itself is going to pay back what I need to, but then B, some of these external factors are accounted for and mitigated. And this model specifically helps address some of those key issues. Thanks. We got a couple.
I think just to add to the risk question, certainly one of the biggest challenges we've faced is a complete lack of data to underpin the decision making. So you have to price these projects on a worst case scenario, having regard for what you know or don't know. And it creates a massive spread in terms of the investment parameters. And oddly enough, one of the major challenges we found is when projects are too successful, and consequently, as the PPP investors, you make too much money.
That problem too.
You find, certainly with respect to governments, where officials change, your government officials change, and you may have dealt with a certain set of officials to start, and 5 years down the line, they look at it purely, what is the return at that point in time, and it looks excessively large, but they forget that if you look at it relative to what government is earning versus what they were to start, they're substantially better off, but it creates this desire to renegotiate deals down the line. and it's a major challenge.
It is, and I think two things that we built into this model to address that. So the first one is in terms of, you're absolutely right. There are, when you look across, let me go back to this slide real quick. There we go. When you look across the types of projects that are often undertaken within the context of a smart city program, these things have very different profiles, right? So you have some things that you can say are pretty well understood. When you look at things, energy efficiency programs, energy generation programs, like I can tell you pretty well, I have a model on my computer of what a solar farm is going to return, right? Very well understood. Versus other things like investments in transportation, right? A lot of times those are much harder to, there is no model, right? Everywhere is going to be different. And so one of the things we like to do is when we start with this plan, we take that into account. And so as I mentioned, you may have a list of 20 things that you want to do over a 30-year period. What we typically do is we start with, in the beginning, we start with those very well understood models first. Because it turns out that those very well understood models, your energy programs, your telecommunications programs, those typically form the underpinning for a lot of these other use cases and programs anyway. And what that enables is you to start off your program with a pretty low risk, pretty well understood set of projects. And then what we do is we introduce pilots of some of these other programs that we need to understand better. So as an example, one of the things we're doing is we're introducing a parking pilot for one city where we're doing some energy projects, some very specific, well understood projects, and then we're putting in a pilot. We're doing another one for waste management where we want to see how those projects perform over 18 months. And then based on the pilot, then in the next 18-month cycle, we can actually expand it out because then we have a good understanding of what the business model will really look like. So that's one way to do it is, and again, this is nice when you have kind of the diversity of a lot of different programs, which is one of the benefits of a smart city, is you can use some of the less risky, more mature, well understood programs to backstop and offset some of the more forward-leaning, less understood projects. And over time, right, those less understood projects become well understood, and then that paves the way for future programs. And that's really what keeps this type of smart city program always on the cutting edge, right? Because you're always able to introduce new things as they come along and test them out, right? And some will be successes and some won't. But if you're scaling them appropriately when you test them, it doesn't impact the program overall. And I'm sorry, what was your second question again? Because it was a good part. Okay. Oh, is this more statement? Okay. Well, okay, yeah. So I think that's one of the key ones because that's absolutely always the case. Absolutely. We had a couple more questions over here. This gentleman. Yeah, we have.
Right, I think this will have to be the last question,
okay.
As we're going to be wrapping up.
Very good.
Okay, thank you. One of the most common thing that we hear about is smart cities. What about something like smart agriculture or smart weather? Something apart from the city side of the things, smart rural side of the things, talking about the inclusiveness of what my friend was talking before. So is there interest in that side of the things too, or what is it like?
Absolutely. Again, we call smart cities. I'm not sure who invented that term, but it really is all about, that's why we put on here. I think it's about smart communities, right? Because when you take things like, smart agriculture, for example, is critical to the success, of a country. And so you can take, while this particular, paradigm is structured around a city, it works anywhere. And so the key is really to identify who the community is you want to impact. That could be a collective of farmers. It could be a village. It could be, again, a country. And once you identify that community that you're looking to build a program around, really anything's on the table, because the really nice part about smart infrastructure and data is that it can, and IoT, right, is that it really can impact any of these different areas. And certainly agriculture is no different. A rural community is no different. They oftentimes, again, have greater needs, right? And so that's definitely something important to keep in mind. So
thank you very much. Indeed, Brandon. Alistair, would you like to have a closing remark?
magic wand would be to have all his knowledge around BTP. So big thank you to Brandon. There you go. There you go. That's. If you have any further questions, we will be in the room for a little bit. If you have any one-to-one questions, please let us know. And thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.